welcome. I'm sorry we're a little late in starting, but there was an overrun, as you know, at the initial session there, which I'm sure you found as stimulating as I did. My name's Gus MacDonald. I was Minister of Transport in the United Kingdom for a couple of very turbulent years. Most of the time since, I've been with Macquarie, which is the Australian financial company, which is probably the biggest private sector investor and operator in infrastructure globally. So I've also been involved for the last 5 years or so with the OECD in its various future programs on infrastructure needs. And our initial report looked at infrastructure needs until 2030 and found a huge gap between the growing demand and the ability of governments to match that demand. A gap that ran into tens of trillions of dollars and was expanding by the year, and that was before the global financial crisis. The OECD have just completed another survey which looks at transport connections intercontinentally up until 2050. And again, the gap is still widening, and in some areas of transport, as we heard in the initial session, the growth in transport demand is outpacing the growth in GDP quite markedly. In areas like containers, for instance, it's about 3 times the rate of GDP in terms of its increase. So the demands will be remarkable. And as you see in the outline of our agenda, we're saying, is there a chronic funding problem for transport? Why is that? And one of the reasons, again, you had it mentioned in the initial session, is simply as a result of democracy in many cases. That if you ask people what their priorities are, they will tell you that their priorities are about health, education, care for the elderly, law and order, and infrastructure might be pretty far down the list. And of course, for politicians working in a political cycle of 4 years until their next election, the planning and construction cycle of infrastructure takes it well out of synchronization with their ambitions, and therefore it's much easier to sweat the assets, and the assets in transport have been regularly sweated in almost every country by politicians under pressure. Now, what we want to look at today is whether there is relief coming from increased private investment. And of course, private investment is already very large in many countries, because we've got privatized aviation and airports and much of the transport sector just in the UK where I come from. But there's also the question of whether more money can be raised from the private sector, which would have been needed anyway, according to the OECD, despite the global financial crisis. And that obviously has shaken governments very badly, and it's also curbed the enthusiasm of the private sector in some areas, but the animal spirits do seem to be reviving again there. And if we look at what the options are, and you'll hear more of this obviously from our panelists, we're looking to privatization. There's been over $1 trillion worth of privatization across over 100 countries in the last couple of decades. There could be an awful lot more, and as you can see, the pressure is on, particularly in European countries that are under fiscal pressures, to privatize many of their transport assets. There's also the question of user charging and whether we should be moving towards that, either to help the funding of infrastructure or for more rational allocation of resources. Is there an argument for increasing prices? Are we wrong to subsidize transport quite so much? Is there any areas of waste that we can identify in the private sector or the public sector in transport? And can we do more with less, or must we reconcile ourselves to doing less with less? Now, just to end my introduction, let me say that from the private sector financial markets, if we look at the capital at the moment, there's a massive supply of capital looking for investment in infrastructure. Some of it's coming from infrastructure funds, some from sovereign wealth funds. But out there, you've got an institutional sector with about $65 trillion worth of assets, and the OECD, again, is recommending that we look to a way of tapping into pension funds and other institutional pots of money there. So the supply of capital at the moment, chasing infrastructure, is larger than the pool of assets that are available for sale. So one has to ask, if a lot more privatization or PPPs take place, will that help to balance the demand and supply in terms of investment? Now, the credit quality of a lot of the assets that might be coming in the market is strong. The debt availability is there for them. The underwriting deals are coming back. There's a willingness to take risk in the private sector. The bond markets are particularly hot at the moment, rather than just the debt markets. And the transport assets have proven to be reasonably resilient throughout the financial crisis. So the risk appetite is about the same as it was before the global financial crisis. And there is a lot of refinancing just waiting to happen in the next few years, but it looks as though the money will be there to satisfy it. So that's just by way of introduction from my areas of special interest. Let me just introduce you one by one to our panel. I've asked them to speak for about 4 minutes each, and just what they see to be the priorities at the moment in the agenda that you have before us. So I'll go along the panel here, and if they're each speaking for about 4 minutes, in total we should have about half an hour of those statements. Then we'll have a general discussion on the panel and also comments from the floor. So let me start on the far left here with Roberto Karstrm, who is from Sweden, background in the Ministry of Finance, and present position as chairman of the Swedish Forum for Innovation and Strategies in the Transport Sector. Urban, your priorities in 4 minutes.
In the with the financial issues, I will start my remarks with some comments from that perspective. And it's obvious that the last years has really seen the problems of the integrated global financial market. But on the other hand, we have realized the importance of a well-functioning financial market, capital markets, and how we can benefit from it when the markets are functioning well. It connects long-term saving with long-term investment, not at least in the sector of transport. It allocates cost over time, especially important for investments that are really long-term, as we are facing in the transport sector. What we see now, I think, is a process of re-regulation, hopefully on an international level of the financial markets, increasing capital requirements, making the supervision more well-functioning, all with the aim and purpose to increase the transparency. And I think that is important, not at least for the different financial instruments that we can be using in the financial sector, and to stabilize and to guarantee, if we can, the financial stability. We will gain, all of us, not at least in transport sector, to keep, to preserve, to have a well-balanced international capital market for our needs. The financial crisis did have a second round of effects, especially on the governments. We see a lot of governmental financial problems in governments all around. More severe in some countries than in others. For instance, in Sweden, we had our big problems with financing the state budget in the 90s. We learned that lessons. It took a long time to restructure and to come back to a balanced situations. And I think that will be the case in many countries all around the world. And that will have severe problems on the capability of financing, not at least investments in the in the transport sector. So we are really facing some problems. That's my opinion. That will increase the pressure for different kinds of off-budget financing, different kinds of solutions, privatization, but also other ways of new mechanisms. And as everything else in life, it has pros and cons. And there are no free lunches whatsoever. Everything needs to be paid, even though we are using new mechanisms. One of the lessons learned from the financial crisis that I think applies to the issues that we are discussing today is the the necessity of transparency and to build confidence for the different mechanisms, not at least for financing investments that we will be discussing and using. So there are problems out there that has to do with how we structure things, how we put things together. But there are also opportunities for next step in using user charges. I think that is an important step to be taken. I think there are cases for PPP solutions, but that won't solve all the problems. There are certain cases that could be well used as PPP investments. And I think the third issue that I would like to highlight is measures to increase the efficiency in the sector by innovations. I think we can gain a lot of working with innovations and working closer together between the private sector and the public sector to concentrate on innovations that are really key to both parts of society. But, my last point, but whatever we do, infrastructure need to be paid, either by taxpayers today or tomorrow, or by the users of the infrastructures. A new innovative financing mechanism will not change that, but it will make it possible to bring projects on stream more quickly. That is important. New aspects of financing underlines what we always have been discussing in the transport sector. And we need to focus on these more basic issues. Which projects, which investments do have long-term benefits to our society? We should concentrate on them. And that is the key issues that we have to be discussed, that we need to discuss.
Thank you, Urban. And if you could hand that over to Roberta. Roberta Garcia is director of the Mexican Institute of Transport. So a different perspective from you, Roberto, in 4 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Well, as you might know, Mexico has a rather better position in terms of the fiscal deficit recently, comparing, for instance, to Spain or USA. Mexico has 2.5% of gross domestic product as a fiscal deficit. That is part of the result of a policy of having good macroeconomic stability, which allows it to contribute to transport infrastructure investments. In fact, in the case of Mexico, the private investment has been seen as a complement to public investment, and it has helped mainly to invest in projects where a clear demand is growing and mainly for toll roads and other main national infrastructure for in other modes of transport like airports, ports, terminals, as well as as operating the main rail networks, which are mostly 100% devoted to freight. So this has been a policy which has attracted a good portion of investment in transport infrastructure in Mexico. For instance, we have seen in the last 10 years part of private investment has been around 40% of the total investment, and recently, of course, because of the financial worldwide crisis, this has been reduced as a proportion, but not in absolute numbers. We still have a good amount of investment from the private sector. What are the kind of projects we have seen where we have counted with the private investment? Those are, as I said, mainly interurban transport infrastructure, and in roads has taken the biggest part of that, but also different. Now we have been starting with some urban transport projects, mass transit projects. We have had success in a project in Mexico for a what we call suburban train, and where we have a Spanish investment company who's won the concession, and we also are having some successes in BRT systems in Mexico City and in other systems with joint schemes with fiscal resources as well as private investments. So I think in general that private resources are there to gain, to make profits, of course, and the role of the state, in our case of the federal or state governments, is to try to put an adequate environment in terms of legal transparency and stability, a clear share of risks in every project, and try to find the right projects where the private sector could be involved. Additional benefits to the increased investments of the complementary resources would be, of course, a better care of operating, of cutting costs for operating, as well as for service for users.
Thank you, Roberto. And Gabriel Gutierrez is with Cintra. He's project director there, and Cintra are probably, if not the leading private sector developer of transport infrastructure, right up amongst the top there. So what's your experience at the moment of building your roads and tunnels and everything else?
Well, thank you very much. I noticed that both Macquarie and Cintra are leading the transportation development. It is true that both companies are right at the leading part of it. Well, what I see is that public administrations have a couple of challenges here. They need to develop a balanced network that works for mobility purposes, and they need to fund it. And here's where developers can add some of the answers, some of the solutions to those problems. Developers such as Cintra, they design, build the road, they operate it, which is the most critical part as a developer. We are an investor operator, and we finally return it to the administration. And what we do basically is, at the level of service that the administration defines, we provide the most efficient solution in operating that road, most efficient from the operational side and from the taking into account the economics of the development of the operation. And I said whether accurate or whether it is that level of service, whether it is just accurate or whether it is a high level of service, because that's for the administration to decide. And like I said, the private institutions tend to be more efficient, so we can help a lot in that area. But we also we can also be part of the solution for the two challenges that I mentioned. First of all, to balance the network. They can use certain mechanisms such as PPP concessions, particularly those that are related to tolls, to real tolls that are being charged to the user, because in that way they can sort of make the best solution for the overall network. They can disincentivize those users that are going to abuse or make a free use of a very vast network of roads. That what it's going to do is to sort of change the balance and balance the network. And it can help transfer funds to develop that part of the network that is being subsidized. And by that I'm also addressing the second issue, which is funding. And it's not a surprise to anyone in this room that in most countries and most local administrations, not all, that doesn't apply to every single country, there is a funding problem, not just for transport, but even for all the infrastructure that are needed, such as social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, etc. And here the public administrations, they need to find a way in which they can develop those assets, that part of the network that is absolutely necessary, that needs to be subsidized, such as public transport, schools, etc. But they need money from that. We can offer that money, and they can find probably the best solution in which the public and the private sector cooperate together.
Right. Well, thank you, Gabriel. You ended on money there, and Helena Mizrahi-Walden is the head of transportation and securitization at the BNP Paribas Bank. So, Helena, what are your priorities looking at it from a banker's perspective?
Thank you. On the subject, more with less, shrinking budgets and growing demand, I would have liked to raise my hand and say, well, I've got one possible solution, securitization. And at the same time, I feel I've just said a bad word. So why is it that what is commonly accepted as one of the sources of the crisis could actually be also one of the solutions to this very crisis and the funding and the current funding gap? I would like to come back on the fundamentals of securitization. Securitization is a technique. It is about creating securities which are asset-backed by any asset, be it project finance for PPP, aircraft, vessels, residential houses, commercial houses, buildings as well. It is a technique which is about financing all these assets by tapping debt capital market. So it is away from bank funding and all the problems that currently the banks are being faced with, in particular the funding cost and the fact that the banks themselves are borrowing money and as such can find themselves short of money. Securitization is about pure disintermediation between directly the ones who have the capital, namely pension funds, health funds, insurance funds, and the direct users of it, namely projects, any user of asset, like I said, aircraft, mortgage, any project. So securitization is a technique relying on a very stable source of funding which needs to be reinjected in the economy. Now, why currently securitization is not proposed as an answer? It is being faced with a problem which is its very bad image, and also the fact that it's a technique which is covering a very diversified reality. You don't finance in the same way a mortgage or an aircraft or an airport project, but at the end of the day, you tap the same source of finance, which is debt capital market. I think it is a shame that today the only focus on securitization is to regulate it as something which has been wrongly applied, and in doing so, treating this technique as a bad technique. I think the positive aspect should be seen as a disintermediation tool and as a good way of reinjecting private capital into the economy and bridging the gap which perhaps the funding gaps which perhaps the banks won't be able of completely doing.
Right. Thank you. And Let me move now to Joris Aal. Joris is from the Netherlands, where he's the General Director of the Centre for Transportation and Navigation, and he also serves as President of the Organisation of European National Road Research Centres. Joris, your priorities.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for the opportunity to say something here. And but let me say beforehand that I am a representative of a road administration, and of course that sort of colors my view on things a little bit. I'm not a financier, I'm not even an economist. So, but from that point of view, let me share a few remarks with you. The one I think was recognizing that investment in new infrastructure is necessary and will be necessary for a long time to come. I must point out that about 90%, maybe even more in some countries, of the infrastructure already exists. And we heard this morning that it's all very popular for politicians to open new projects. But who is going to win the popularity prize with maintenance? Well, we had the same thing in the Netherlands, and I must say that opening newly maintained roads did not really stimulate very much political attention. So there is the question of maintaining what we have and interesting other financing partners in that particular problem. Talking about maintenance, I think the other part of that is when we talk about new projects, are we really certain what the life cycle cost is of such a project? I doubt it. In the Netherlands, we have not yet found out, in any case, how exactly to take into account not only the technical life cycle cost, but also the environmental and societal life cycle cost. Other example that came up already this morning. A second point I'd like to make is the paradox that might come up when the economy would sort of climb out of the recession that it's in now. All our scenarios say that there will be an increased demand of mobility. So it will probably be inevitable that we will be managing demand in the future. Now, how does managing demand relate to financing and to profiting from infrastructure? Is there a paradox or isn't there? I think there might be, and that also goes hand in hand with government regulation. Government regulation might well be a constraint on the interest of private parties in participating or investing in infrastructure, let alone in maintenance. I would like to take up the point that Urban Karstrm said as well. I think one of the concern that I have is when we try in the Netherlands to interest parties in coming up with innovative solutions, it proves to be very, very difficult. Maybe it's because we have a wrong procurement system. It's possible, although I think we are making progress in improving it. But basically, what the private sector, contractors and so on, usually come up with is the traditional answer for the traditional problem. And I think we are still thinking how to challenge the private sector and what we can do as governments also to challenge the private sector to come up with innovative solutions, not only in terms of recyclable asphalt or something, but also in terms of intelligent systems, of which, by the way, the life cycle is a lot shorter than the asphalt that we're used to talking about. So these are concerns, and I think solutions, I think some of my predecessors said there is no one single solution. So what is the right mix of solutions to tackle this and to come up with new investments and with that the maintenance of that what we already have? Thank you.
Right, thank you, Joris. Paolo Acosta has had a fascinating career, Professor of Economics, then Minister for Public Works in Italy, a member of the European Parliament, and then one of the unique challenges in transport, Mayor of Venice, and is now running the Port Authority in Venice. So your priorities for this debate, Paolo?
my only priority is not to end up with instead of doing more with less, to doing less because of less, because it looks like that we are moving in this direction. And so, but I presume that we should try to distinguish what could be my answer before the crisis and now. Because you already mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that even a few years ago, we are already recognizing a gap between the prospective demand from transport, both infrastructure and services, and the supply. So, which was the problem at that moment? In my view, was the problem that's the financial problem in general of these infrastructure and services, is that we were and we are still managing the transition between a scheme in which transport was more or less treated as a public good. It was taxpayer money. It was given to everybody almost for nothing when possible, or the prices that doesn't correspond in many cases not to the cost. Of course, there's plenty of difference to be done within transport, of course. But anyhow, I'm going to mass transit in the cities, or the rail problem and so on. So I'm talking about these areas in which it was treated for a long time for the public goods. And I'm not talking about the emerging societies, which is a totally different situation, which they are, and so that. But so this was the problem. And we are trying to identify, to move to the taxpayer financing, to the user paying, sometimes user and polluter pay. But the root of the problem is that when we decide, or we are trying to decide to move from one to the other, is much more a problem, I would say, of fairness and equity, because it means if you don't treat as when we are moving from a bank solution. One was taxpayer money for everybody for nothing, but if we move too quickly to the other side, will be paid by the user, but only for the user that can afford that. And so there is an exclusion, which, since the general theme of our forum this year is people first, it looks like a little bit some problems in that direction. So it seems to me that we have to manage how to stay in between these two ideas. But from the institution or the organization of the way of financing the system, we are still halfway. So somebody is still in one side or the other. So that's it looks like that's difficult. What's happened because of the crisis? In my view, it's happened that if we are talking, I'm talking mainly of the so-called mature economies, or the European economies generally. Now, because of reasons that have nothing to do with the transport, there is no public money, no debt. There are a lot of countries that have to reduce their own debt. They cannot look for any. So it's not the government is intermediating this possibility. And then leave the only possibility to find out some institutional framework in which we induce somebody else to do that. But somebody else will try to get as much money as possible. So how we can organize the fact that he has to get as money as possible? Is a problem of some kind of subsidy, which is a difference between the one and the two, which is the old solution of these things? Or is there any other things to do? It seems to me that we have to fine-tune this possibility. That's why, in general, I'm more pro some kind of PPP approach than more privatization. Privatization means take care of this and that's your problem. I don't care anymore. Mm-hmm. I don't think that at the end of the day we'll be able to maintain the difficult equilibrium to have a more efficient system and a more fair or equitable or open, not excluding system which is in the situation. In any case, it's clear that if we move from taxpayer to the other one, we have to increase prices. How much people are ready to pay for this kind of transport? We have to educate them to do that much more. For instance, urban transport is, by definition, there is some law, like in my country, that says that the consumer has to pay 30% of the cost. And 10% of the cost was assumed to be the maximum that's to be paid for that. It's clearly they cannot anymore do that way, because otherwise, it's true that there is a lot of money around the world. But I don't think that if you don't offer a proper internal rate of return, everybody will come to you. And so it seems to me it is a problem of pricing, which means let people understand that the priority for this sector is diminishing and the shadow prices are much higher, so that you have to increase it somehow. It's a problem of organizing the better choices and priorities. There's another point that's completely different. I don't see any institution able to maintain for a long time their own priorities. And when we talk about infrastructure, that's a real problem. If you change well, I could give you an example of my country, so I don't want to upset anybody else. In my country, we are changing priority every 5 years. Or if you not, I could say even more 5 days and 5 years. So how can you imagine that somebody will accept to put a lot of money on a project that maybe tomorrow you will change completely? So so in my view, since we are changing completely the system from something which was totally in the hand of the government to something that has to be much more in the hand of the private partners, because they can guarantee a better efficiency, but since we have to retain, in my view, some possibility to control it, is a problem to identify. And I don't see, there is a lot of, I try to study a lot of examples and carry myself some experience in PP projects. I don't think we have stabilized. There are not such a best practice that we can advise easily in any place. Maybe this is an area in which we could do something more, even at the OECD.
Let me pick up on one of the key issues that come up here, that the starkest method of raising money is privatization. It's been used pretty widely. Obviously, in the present crisis of the Eurozone, the squeeze is being put on Greece and Ireland and Portugal and who knows, Spain and others. Other countries like the UK are voluntarily privatizing areas, national air traffic systems or high-speed rail links and so on. So let me just put this to the panel. Where do you stand on this? Is privatization, politically difficult though it may be, is that the best way of getting the private sector and private money and private sector efficiencies, if you believe in them, in to help with this crisis? You'll be for PPP rather than privatization, are you? But where do you stand on privatization, Gabriel?
Well, I mean, privatization for sure is going to bring all of what we mentioned earlier about the private sector bringing efficiency and being able to run certain assets and adding to the overall network. In the end, the main difference that I see there between privatization and public-private partnerships, much of it has to do with the timing of the arrangement and the sort of collaboration of the arrangement. It really depends on the type of assets. In the case of roads, I mean, either could work. Obviously, for a private institution to have a pure privatization is going to be very attractive, but often you cannot extract some. Here I'm referring only to roads, not to airports or other assets that do have a different dynamic. In the case of roads, it's so embedded in a network that it's hard to privatize that specific asset and to extract it from the network, because eventually it is going to be affected. So you need there some arrangement between the public and the private to make sure that it works for both of them, and at the same time, as long as the timing during which that asset is being run by the private institution is long enough, over 30 years. I tend to think that's a very short time, but I think there are already arrangements there of 50 to 100 years. That's already long enough for any asset to be run economically efficiently. So it works for the private part, and it also sort of rules out any concerns in the public, among the people and the public administration, that those specific assets may be abused or may have been taken from the overall public.
Well, let me bring Roberto in here, because one of the points that I think Paula also touched on was when we talk about this huge infrastructure gap and the need for new infrastructure and all this private money wanting to invest in it, it doesn't include often the developing world, because pension funds and others don't want to get into areas with poor governance, political instability, and so on. So there's a lot of money out there, but it's usually looking for brownfield assets with proven track records in mature economies. So it's looking for an M&A market. Is it better in developing economies to go straight to privatization and depend on regulation and the power of contract to get your results?
Yes, of course, we need as a pre-requirement, I think, the political stability that you mentioned, and also some long-term confidence in the economy. But we have worked a lot on have clearer contracts. We have a second-generation PPP projects for roads, and I think it's working much better. And we also think, a very clear legal environment is also needed for that. And we have the luck, I think, of being an economy in growth, a growing economy. So we have new projects which are not like a brownfield, but they are very, very profitable because, for instance, in the case of roads, we have bypasses for cities which didn't exist before, and where we can assure an important demand for them. So those are attractive for the private sector to invest in and to operate them. And even though when it's not a real internal rate of return enough, big enough for them, of course there's a political will to attract those investments. So a share of public resources must be put into those projects. On the other hand, we have had a lot of success in port terminals, for instance, where they bid for the concession of operating and improving the infrastructure they receive for terms of 30 years or something like that, and that has been very successful, especially in the market of container terminals. And on the other side, we have had success in the privatization of rails, where we have a couple of private companies which are competing, two main companies in the country. And I think, of course, the original assets have been bidded for them, and they have paid different amounts, but it has been clear enough to allow them to invest in the improvement of the infrastructure, as well as in the operation, and the growth in freight traffic in those companies has been increasing since '96, where it took place. So we are looking at, I think, very positively and very optimistic in the ways we have been handling the involvement of the private sector.
And just with Juris and Urban and Helena here, the OECD have said that one of the ways forward perhaps for transport is to try and base any regulation perhaps on a regulated asset base. So you've got a proper sense of what the assets are, you see the assets being built, the owners get a return on that asset, the owners and operators, and that this should be extended far further into transport than is the case at the moment. As I say, that's one of the OECD's most recent suggestions. Are you familiar with this, or have you got any thoughts on how that might be applied and whether it would help?
Yeah, I mean, you asked the question, are you for or against privatization?
Yes, but if you privatize, you've got to regulate. Sure. Regulated asset base?
Exactly. It depends very much on what kind of assets we are talking about. It depends very much on what kind of services we are talking about. I can see examples of assets that we shouldn't privatize at all, because it's even worse to have a private monopoly than to have a public monopoly. if there's a kind of assets that are natural monopolies, they should stay in public ownership. I think that's
if they're natural monopolies.
If it's natural monopolies, so it depends very much on the kind of assets we are talking about.
But you can have natural monopolies like water, where that's been privatized pretty successfully in the UK.
Well, yes, look into the models, but to use a model where to have a model where we will have a private monopoly, and it means that we are pricing it in a less efficient way from an economic point of view. That is not the way forward. I don't think that is the way to go. I think there's a lot of transport services that in some countries are publicly owned and run. They could very well be privatized because there is a market for services, or we can create the market for services. In that case, privatization is a way to go, which will increase efficiency and also lessen the burden of financing. But it depends very much of the institutions. It depends very much of the kind of assets or services we are talking about. It depends very much on the regulations. And we need to remember who is going to pay at the end. How do we construct the regulations or the institutional framework? And that is important to answer your basic question, and crucial to do that.
Although in Sweden, you wouldn't have as much pressure as in many other countries to find the money and have to privatize the assets to get the returns.
That's right. I mean, the public budget is almost in balance in Sweden, so from that point of view, we are lucky. But still, the reason for privatization or discussing the other models, in my opinion, is rather an efficiency issue. It should be driven by moving towards more of an efficient solutions to using the resources from efficient, and that is as well important in Sweden as in other countries, independent on the financial situation for the public budgets.
Right. Helena?
Well, I think it can be actually quite a complicated issue because, for example, if you look at the airport situation in the UK, the way they are being financed, some of them is precisely by using regulated assets, taxation. And what happens is because you are still in the private world, then you have, if you take the example of Heathrow, Heathrow is regulated, so any passenger traveling through that airport pays tax, the passenger tax. Now, because we are in the private world, certain airlines to go around this taxation issue go and land in other airports, and this is typically the low-cost airline model. So you are in a private world, but yet at the same time you tax it. That creates intrinsically within that sector competitions as well, which create other business models. So it's not just, indeed, I mean, the regulated asset base allows to have a very good visibility in terms of pricing, allows also to project cash flows and get visibility on traffic. But then you have other players in the same sector who reacts to it and who can then create other business model. Now, this is potentially good for the passenger because I believe that competition is good in order to obtain the bus service. But at the same time, it in the private world, it then drags some public management drivers, such as the regulated asset base factor. So I think it's a complicated issue, in fact, which should be seen sector by sector.
But you're for more privatization. You don't have too many qualms about that. If countries need the money, they should privatize.
Yes, well, I look very much at this type of thing. Yes, private funding, privatization. Yes, this is how usually, I mean, when you go to investors and you sell a transaction in order for them to finance this transaction, if you usually sell a story, you sell a business case. So unless there is the support of the government, you're very much looking at a story for its own merits, which economically must make sense.
And Joris, you mentioned the importance of regulation, but as far as privatization is concerned,